Hello, hello. Welcome to the stream. It's been a couple of weeks. It was the day before Thanksgiving, and then I had a wretched 24-hour cold that put me completely out of commission. But I'm back now, maybe slightly congested, but alive, and well enough to spend some time reading with you again. So, this is, I think, session 5 or 6 of book club. We are continuing to read High Conflict. Hello, Logic. Welcome back. I think Pringle is also going to be joining us here shortly if she is not already here. It's good to be back. I will, and I do have a little confession before we begin. I forgot that we had book club and I took my bedtime adult gummy early. So we'll see how this goes. I'm feeling okay. I'm feeling like I can be reading. Um, but just in case I'm like a space cadet, you know why. Okay, so last time we finished part one, we are on to part two. And so part one was into conflict. Part two is called out of conflict. And we are starting with chapter 4. Chapter 4, Buying Time. As he got older, Curtis got better at staying out of prison. He studied the law and the minefields of the so-called war on drugs. The law punished crack possession much more harshly than cocaine, so Curtis never carried crack. If he got caught with 5 kilos of raw cocaine, he knew he was facing about 10 years, far less than he'd get for the same amount of crack. He resigned himself to doing the 10 years if need be, which is like, I mean, oh, the headphones are just not working tonight. Technically, good business sense here. Curtis got accustomed to a feeling of heaviness that came over him every so often, especially on Mother's Day and his mom's birthday. He still fantasized about finding his stepdad and Billy, the boy who had killed his basketball hero, but he got better at controlling the Hulk switch in his head. He got married to his lifelong girlfriend, the one who had worked at the McDonald's all those years ago. Oh my God. Crazy. He had 4 kids. He withdrew from some of the more violent obligations of gang life. Other people took those risks. Younger people. Years went by, and it seemed to Curtis, in his early 30s by then, like he would spend the rest of his life watching over his shoulder or in prison. Then something unexpected happened at his son's fourth grade graduation. Curtis was, at the time, expecting to go back to prison any day. The feds were targeting gang leaders in Chicago, and people all around him were getting locked up. He knew it was just a matter of time. On that day, though, his son stood up with his classmates and sang that old Chicago song, You're the Inspiration. It was a cliche, and Curtis knew it. But for some reason, as he stood there watching his son sing, the song felt like a knife to his heart. Curtis's son was autistic, and Curtis felt sure he knew the reason. He had been violent toward the boy's mother when she was pregnant. Then, after the baby was born, Curtis had driven around with his son in the back of the car when he'd gone out shooting rivals or getting shot at by them. No wonder the boy was terrified of loud noises. The fault lines were not hard to find, Curtis thought, and they all led back to him, the father and the gang leader. Oh my God, that's like, that is intense, regardless of whether or not it is quite literally true. The emotional truth there is crazy. As he listened, he did the math. If the feds nabbed him today, his son would be 18 when Curtis got out of prison. And right then, it was as if the lies he had told himself about Benji Wilson's murder, his life with the Stones, the need to meet every affront with violence, just collapsed in on themselves. The biggest lie was that he was doing what he did for his family, to provide and protect. He just couldn't buy that line anymore. If he was selling drugs for his family, why did he have 4 cars? Was it helpful to his family if he disappeared into a cage for a decade? Oh, fuck, he thought. Very well placed F bomb, I'll say. Sitting there, tears streaming down his face, he offered up a foxhole prayer he'd said many times before. God, just give me one more chance. His wife looked over at him and did a double take. Was he crying? Curtis was not a man who cried in public or in private. He was the guy who had beaten up her boss at McDonald's because of some dude's hat. Who was this guy? He didn't explain himself to her, though. That was not something he knew how to do back then. There's like there's like layers to this already. I leaving Scientology for me was less a process of deciding that I didn't believe in the religion anymore and way more a coming to terms with being okay with losing the relationships that I had built there because leaving that side meant everybody who didn't leave with me, I was now the enemy. And I think that's way harder. That is a much more difficult thing to get somebody unstuck from is relationships rather than beliefs. I don't know. There's something there. Afterward, Curtis tried to return to normal. He picked up a shipment of drugs to sell, like usual, but this time, driving away with the drugs in the car, it felt different. There was no thrill, no sense of power and purpose. It was just depressing. He knew he had to bag the drugs and distribute them just like he'd always done, but it seemed pointless. Why am I doing this? He kept asking himself. He had no good answers anymore. When he got home, he did nothing. He just left the stash there untouched for a week, something he'd never done before. His cousin called and called, but Curtis didn't answer. It was like his mind knew what to do, but his body wouldn't comply. Finally, his cousin showed up and demanded he hand over the drugs, which he did. He also gave his cousin one of his cars, a Chrysler, so he could sell it and use the money to hire someone to do the tasks Curtis was supposed to do. This is what's known as a saturation point, the point where the losses of a conflict finally seem heavier than the gains. Curtis had hit bottom, a critical moment for anyone who shifts out of high conflict. Sitting there, surrounded by drugs he didn't have the energy to bag, his mindset was not so different from that of so many other people who finally have had enough. Divorcing spouses who call up their lawyers and tell them to make a deal, senators who announce they will not run for re-election, guerrilla fighters who quietly walk away from their unit and never come back. Can we talk about fucking Mitch McConnell retiring, by the way? Holy shit. I am. It is very tragic that that man is still alive, but I am delighted to see the back of him for sure. Fuck that guy. Not to be high conflict or anything, but goddamn. About 6 months later, Curtis called his cousin. I'm done. You can have everything. Silence. His cousin was waiting, Curtis realized, for the code word. The one they'd agreed to use should he ever get caught, so his cousin knew to get rid of everything. The drugs, the money, the guns. But Curtis didn't say the code word. Not that day, and not ever. He didn't say anything. The silence stretched out uncomfortably. Yeah, turbo fuck that guy. Sorry, not Curtis. Curtis is great. We love Curtis. The silence stretched out uncomfortably. Finally, his cousin broke it. What's up, cuz? They got you? No. More silence. There was only one other explanation. Motherfucker, you trying to set me up? His cousin yelled. No, come on, Curtis said, irritated now. I'm just done. He gave his cousin a large sum of cash and some narcotics. He also gave away the strip club he owned. He felt lighter at first, like he could breathe. He had taken this nest of lies off his back, and now he could stand up straight, be his own man. Even if I get locked up, I'm okay, he told himself. And I can face my son, even if I'm incarcerated. I stopped. Saturation point. High conflicts happen everywhere, often under different names. On the Philippine island of Mindanao, yes. On the Philippine island of Mindanao, they are known as Rito. Usually, Rito start with a misunderstanding, just like gang conflicts. A cow is found wandering on a man's land, damaging his crops, so the man sells the cow. The animal's owner, thinking the man had stolen his cow, seeks revenge. Clan loyalties turn a dispute into a full on feud. Soon, two men are shot. Rumors can kill. A slight becomes an affront to the dignity of the whole group. Often, Rito intensify around election cycles. So we've got midterms coming up. Be alert, especially like as we get past the holidays and New Year's. Keep an eye out for it. Like in Chicago, these feuds guarantee a baseline level of misery for everyone involved. That misery is the great weakness of high conflict, a vulnerability that can be exploited. Life with Rito is being a prisoner in your house, as one former combatant puts it, sounding exactly like a gang member in Chicago today. You cannot work, you cannot go out of your house, you cannot help anybody because you're afraid your enemy may kill you. Misery creates a saturation point, and a saturation point is a golden hour of opportunity. With gang members, it might happen in the hospital after you've been shot, especially if none of your fellow gang members come to visit you. Or it might happen if your son sings a song on a day you're expecting to get arrested. But the saturation point must be recognized and seized, or it will pass. This is how other people can be so catalytic, by helping combatants identify a saturation point. So that is key. That is super important. And if my adult gummy wasn't working so well, I would have some more smart things to say here. But instead, I'm going to keep reading. In the Philippines, Rito do not get resolved in the formal justice system, generally speaking. Usually, other group members help people see a saturation point. Women play a key role. They are often spared from retaliatory attacks, so they can act as shields and try to initiate talks. Then, elders and other clan leaders work through their networks to repair the damage, often through payments of blood money as compensation. In this way, women and elders can slow down the conflict and create an opening where there was none. People who act as shields are all around us. They have enormous power. In 1809, a friend of both John Adams and Thomas Jefferson began to quietly scheme to get them to start speaking again. Ever so gently, over the course of years, Benjamin Rush, a fellow signer of the Declaration of Independence, conjured a saturation point for both men. He told them he told them each that the other was keen to reconnect. He literally did oh my God, I think he likes you. Oh my God, I think he likes you. And like made it happen. What a queen. Nobody tell me anything bad about Benjamin Rush. He's a historical old white man, which means I'm sure he was evil somehow. But like right now, he's my queen. He even told Adams that he'd had a dream in which the two men were reunited after Adams had written to Jefferson. Was Rush telling the truth? We don't know. But when he told Adams about his dream, he even shared the precise words Adams had used in the so-called letter he'd sent Jefferson in the dream, giving Adams a script to use in real life. I'm going to use that. I need to remember that and use that next time I have friends who are fighting and being stupid about it. He created a path out of high conflict with this dream story. And because he knew his friends so well, Rush made sure to compliment him when he did it. Only a man like Adams, who possessed a oh my god, magnanimity. Oh my god, okay. Only a man like Adams, who possessed a magnanimity known only to great minds, would be capable of such a gracious gesture. It seems too obvious by half, but it worked. On New Year's Day in 1812, Adams wrote a note to Jefferson. It was just as Rush had prophesied in his dream. Jefferson wrote back. Over the next 14 years, the two men exchanged 158 letters. Old man Yowie, old man Yowie. You and I ought not to die, Adams wrote, before we have explained ourselves to each other. This is a fan fiction. This is actually somebody's AO3 account. They didn't always agree, but they remained in good conflict and out of high conflict until they both died on the same day on July 4th, 1826, the 50th anniversary of America's independence. Somebody get on AO3 right now and tell me if this fan fiction exists about John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. That's insane. That is straight up like, and there was only one bed. All right. Quote, people had grown to love my impostor, unquote. One problem with withdrawing from a high conflict is that nothing else changes. Your enemies still think of you as an enemy. Your friends still think of you as who you were, not who you want to be. For the first 6 months or so, Curtis tried to leave the job, but hold on to his identity as a stone. Most especially, he tried to maintain his lifestyle, which cost $9,426 a month in like the 2010s. So that's crazy. Soon, reality set in. The cars started getting repossessed. He couldn't be a gang leader and not participate in the drug market, and he couldn't participate in the drug market without doing violence. So he let the cars go. He moved to an apartment across town, one of the best decisions he made. If people couldn't find him, they couldn't ask him for money or for backup when they needed the Hulk to appear. In this way, he created space for himself, literal space in which to build a new identity. This turns out to be essential. But he still hung out in Foster Park, still socialized with the family and friends he loved. The temptations were constant. He missed the feeling of his pager going off. Oh God, so this is the 90s then. $9,426 a month in the 90s is crazy work. He missed the feeling of his pager going off, the sense that he was part of something important. Finding a respectable job, meanwhile, was like trying to win the lottery. Curtis had a long arrest record and was known to the police for his gang activity. He had no work experience outside of his gang leadership, no story to tell that employers might want to hear. Other people missed the old Curtis too. They did not know this new Curtis, and it seemed like they did not particularly want to know him. People had grown to love my impostor, Curtis said. He and his wife had been together since they were teenagers. They knew one version of each other deeply. But when Curtis began what he calls his transformation, his wife didn't recognize him anymore. Who was this man crying when Oprah gave away cars on TV? Talking about peace all the time? What happened to the brawler she'd fallen in love with? Just when he started doing right in his life, his wife was talking about leaving him. He was terrified. He'd lost so many people, either to death or prison. But no one he'd loved had left him by choice like this. Her reaction confirmed his greatest fear, the fear of most people who try to exit high conflict, that his only value was his old self, his conflict self, and that without it, he was worthless. One day, at his lowest point, his cousin drove up in a new Mercedes Benz S550, a sumptuous vehicle that cost close to $100,000. His cousin opened up the trunk, which was full of narcotics. Man, you know it ain't the same without you, cuz. I need you, man. Curtis stood there, staring in the trunk. It was like his cousin had just tossed him the cyberball. He was back in the game. It felt good to feel needed. If he just did a 90-day comeback, he calculated, he could pay off his bills, get his life back in order, fix his marriage. He could stop letting everyone down for a little while. Vacillation. Most people who try to leave high conflict vacillate between their old lives and their still in progress future selves, sometimes for years. The path out of high conflict is not linear, even in politics. This is true. I was a libertarian for a month in between leaving Scientology and becoming a uh, commie leftist scum. Radio and TV personality Glenn Beck was a quintessential conflict entrepreneur in U.S. politics. Boy, was he. My ex-husband's grandparents watched nothing but Glenn Beck and NCIS. This is true. And they watched a lot of TV. He spent a decade aggressively promoting partisan conflict on Fox News, CNN, and his own subscription TV network. Like other conflict entrepreneurs, he trafficked in grandiose analogies and conspiracy theories that gave his audience a sense of righteous moral clarity. In his first 14 months on Fox News, Beck and his guests alluded to Hitler 115 times, Nazis 134 times, fascism 172 times, the Holocaust 58 times, and Joseph Goebbels 8 times. Beck knew how to exploit the fear of his mostly white audience, telling them that then President Barack Obama was a racist with a deep seated hatred for white people. Through his unique brand of paranoia, outrage, and hysteria, he drew millions of viewers to a bonfire of rage. Then, Beck started acting strangely, beginning in about 2014. In interviews, he began voicing regret, revealing an ambiguity and nuance he'd rarely shown before. I wish I could go back and be more uniting in my language, Beck said on national TV. I think I played a role, unfortunately, in helping tear the country apart, and it's not who we are. It's hard to believe anything Beck says, given his history of exploiting conflict for his own ends. And yet, Beck's behavior didn't make sense if it was disingenuous. It was against his interests in so many ways. In the run up to the 2016 election, Beck broke with his fellow Republicans and most of his audience members to oppose the candidacy of Donald Trump, who he called dangerously unhinged. Rare Glenn Beck W. Countering Trump's incendiary rhetoric on immigration, Beck went to the U.S. border with Mexico and handed out $2 million in toys and food, enraging many of his longtime followers. He invited several Black Lives Matter activists to his studio for a conversation. There are things unique to the African American experience that I cannot relate to, he told the New Yorker. I had to listen to them. As the country became more and more polarized, Beck warned left wing media personalities like comedian and commentator Samantha Bee not to fall into the same conflict trap that had held him in thrall. As a guy who has done damage, I don't want to do any more damage, he said in a surreal appearance on Bee's show. I know what I did. I helped divide. I'm willing to take that. My message to you is please don't make the mistakes that I made. And I think all of us are doing it. We're doing it on Facebook. We're doing it on Twitter. These were uncomfortable statements for Beck to make. He was a founding father of America's modern conflict industrial complex. His media empire was built on demonization and fear, which made it extremely hard for him to pivot. He actually admitted as much in a podcast interview with Krista Tippett. And it's not reasonable to ask people just, well, then throw away your career and just stop doing that. But that's not reasonable. I have 300 employees that count on me getting up every single day, he said. Now, how do I change? How do I make this work so I don't flush the jobs of 300 people? 3 months after making that comment, Beck had to lay off about 20% of his employees at Mercury Radio Arts and The Blaze. His opposition to Trump had cost him many viewers, he knew. Loyalty is very important to the conservative mindset. The old fire starter kept coming back to life. Just 3 months after saying he wished he could be more uniting in his language, Beck called Obama a full-fledged dictator and a sociopath. Whatever else was going on in Beck's mind, it was pretty clear that he was wrestling with his identity, his group, and his business model. He wanted to get his audience passionate about new causes other than hating Obama. He was interested in fighting human trafficking and the exploitation of children, for example, but he could not figure out how. My audience, I can't find a way to make that palpable or not even safe enough for people to watch it. Like Gary in his community board meetings, Beck was trying to play a new game while trapped in the old one. In 2018, he donned a Make America Great Again hat on TV to announce he'd changed his mind and would vote for Trump in 2020. I will tell you, the things that you have done as the president are remarkable. Remarkable. But it was too late for the new Beck to go back to being the old Beck. In November 2019, Beck's cable TV channel went off the air. His radio show continued on, and so did he, stuck in a kind of limbo. Leaving behind a deeply meaningful conflict identity is never linear. For some people, this vacillation never ends. I think in a lot of ways it was kind of a blessing in disguise that I did not have a choice about going no contact with my family. Like, I miss them and would love to talk to them again someday. But I think if I had not had like the time and space to figure out like my identity and values and like really who I am as a person, then I don't know if I would ever have gotten here. Distance. When his cousin pulled up in the new Mercedes Benz that day, Curtis had one precious resource. He had just enough distance, physically and mentally, to pause. As he stared into the trunk, considering his cousin's proposal, he reminded himself of what he knew. There was no end to this conflict. There was no such thing as a 90-day comeback. This conflict was a perpetual motion machine. You sought revenge for one affront, and then there was always another one after that. On and on it went, kind of like politics. Curtis also had a pragmatic concern. He wanted to live. He wanted to be around for his kids. He knew that his heart wasn't in the game anymore, and that made him vulnerable. He couldn't survive if he made mistakes, if he lowered his guard out there on the streets. Nah, man, I'm good, he said finally, turning his cousin down. You're a better man than me, his cousin answered, closing the trunk. No, I'm not. I'm just ready, and you're not. But once you're ready, then we're going to get together and talk. As he watched his cousin drive away, he did not feel good. He did not feel righteous. He felt alone. A week later, Curtis drove into his garage and saw his neighbor. Man, that was messed up what happened to your cousin, the man said. Curtis had no idea what he was talking about. He pulled the car back out and drove to his cousin's house, where he heard the news. His cousin had been kidnapped and killed. The first thought that ran through Curtis's mind was from his old self. Shit, if I was with him, that never would have happened. It was a feeling of guilt and regret, a familiar sensation. The second thought was from his new self. If he'd been with his cousin, he realized, he'd probably be dead too. It would be his family weeping, his body in the morgue. It wasn't hard to imagine, but this thought was surprising all the same. Why wasn't his second thought the same as it had always been, to seek revenge, to make someone pay for the pain he was feeling? Age changes people. And it is one of the most predictable ways that people abandon crime and violence. People get older and wiser. But Curtis knew it was more than that. It was also because he had created some distance between himself and the conflict. Having reached his saturation point and tagged himself out, he was removed from the day to day tit for tat cycle of the streets. And what a difference this made! It gave him space to think other thoughts, to cultivate competing identities. Revenge was no longer the only idea that captured his attention. His stone identity was not the only identity to which he owed allegiance. Time and space turn out to be key to shifting out of high conflict for all kinds of people in all manner of disputes. There are different ways to buy time, as Curtis puts it, but it must be done. In the Philippines, women and other shields buy time by investigating and snuffing out false rumors before they can escalate to violence. With Gary's feuding clients, looping for understanding helps him buy time, slowing down the conversation and making sure people feel heard. One of the greatest dangers of social media is that it speeds conflict up. It holds us captive in the reactive mode of thinking by design, robbing us of time and space. In that sense, it's like an automatic weapon. If you never have to stop to reload, there's no way your loved ones can tackle you and bring you to your senses. Log off. Stop posting. Touch grass. In Gary's own political conflict, it was only because of the election loss that he had the time and space to realize what had happened to him, how far he'd fallen from his own ideals. For some people, this happens after they get fired, or divorced, or sick. Sometimes a crisis creates a sudden, unexpected opening. Countries can buy time too. In the country of Georgia in the 1990s, the government bought loyalty from various groups, literally giving away properties and state agencies to business leaders and mafia bosses. It was a huge risk, layering corruption on top of corruption, but it led to a dramatic drop in violence as the country's old conflict entrepreneurs began to have a stake in the government's success. The Georgian government filled the space it had created, rebuilding its institutions and the trust of the public. That's crazy. I always forget that story. That's such a cool story. After his cousin's death, Curtis knew he'd made the right decision. He still had problems, but doubt wasn't one. That experience dissolved any illusions he'd had about going back. Life did not get easier, but the pull to return to the conflict receded. What he needed, he realized, was a new identity. You have to replace something with something else, he said. For years, he'd filled any emptiness in his life with his vendetta against the disciples. But that satisfaction was always replaced by a new loss, a new quest for revenge. Now he had more stories to tell beyond just that one. Father, husband, Muslim, and those identities competed for attention. This, too, is a common story among people who leave high conflict. It's not enough just to reach a saturation point. They must also find new purpose in a new role to fill the void left by the conflict. Otherwise, they return to the tar pits eventually. Damn, I wanted to kill you. In the mid 1970s, the Palestinian Liberation Organization had a problem. It had created a covert commando unit called Black September, designed to seek revenge for humiliations suffered by the Palestinian people. Very quickly, the ruthless unit had become one of the most feared terrorist organizations in the world. In 1971, Black September had assassinated Jordan's prime minister, gunning him down in the lobby of the Sheraton Hotel in Cairo. The next year, the group had infiltrated the Olympic Village in Munich, kidnapping and eventually massacring 11 Israeli athletes. But times were changing. New diplomatic options were opening up, and terrorism was damaging the Palestinians' reputation. Yasser Arafat, the chairman of the PLO, needed to disband Black September. How could he convince these trained assassins, who devoted their lives to this high conflict, to move on? After months of debate, Arafat's deputies came up with an unusual solution, as described by counterterrorism expert Bruce Hoffman. They introduced the members of Black September to a group of about 100 Palestinian women who they'd recruited from all over the Middle East. They encouraged the commandos to get to know the women. If any of the men and women decided to get married, they were told, they'd get $3,000 and an apartment with appliances and a TV, along with a new nonviolent job. If these married couples had a baby, they'd get another $5,000. It was like a giant singles cruise with very high stakes. The scheme was designed to create new identities for the commandos, ones that crowded out their old ideas of themselves. I'm going to look this up afterwards. I don't know what the source is on this information exactly. It is fascinating either way. To the surprise of everyone involved, the matchmaking worked. All the members of Black September got married, one of Arafat's generals later told Hoffman. Whenever these men were asked to travel to another country on nonviolent business on behalf of the Palestinian government, they declined. They did not want the risk to risk being arrested or killed. Like Curtis, they had new roles as fathers and husbands. Their conflict identity lost much of its grip in the process. I mean, hmm, my brain cell is trying so hard to keep up. After Curtis left his old identity as a stone, a bizarre thing happened. It was a coincidence, really, but a timely one. Another man, also named Curtis, was killed in a motorcycle accident. This other Curtis had grown up in the same neighborhood. He'd attended the same high school. Many people, hearing the news, thought that Curtis Toller was the one who had died. For a few days after that, people came up to Curtis with arms outstretched, embracing him with a warmth he had not expected. Old friends and family members called him up and sounded so relieved when he'd answered. They'd thought he died, and he hadn't. But what stunned Curtis was how much they cared. He'd thought that his value was his role in the conflict, and now that he'd left the Hulk behind, he was surprised to see that people still loved him. Their sense of Curtis was bigger than his own, and this gave him hope. Slowly, Curtis began to fill the space the conflict had left behind. He had always been curious, since he was a moonwalking little kid in Foster Park. He'd never lost that desire to understand how things worked. Now he started reading more, studying the history of race and violence in America. He read The Miseducation of the Negro by Carter G. Woodson, a book that had come out in 1933 but felt timely to Curtis. A teacher, Woodson chronicled the ways that Black Americans had been utterly failed by schools, taught that their race was unclean and unworthy. He revealed the indoctrination that kept Black people oppressed with or without force. If you can control a man's thinking, you do not have to worry about his action, Woodson wrote. If you make a man feel that he is inferior, you do not have to compel him to accept an inferior status, for he will seek it himself. Reading this, Curtis started to see bigger problems he had not noticed before, circumstances that did not justify his past, but helped explain it. It took me out of the existing world that I was in. He read J.A. Rogers' From Superman to Man, a 1917 novel about the ignorance of racism. Curtis started to see the ways in which the Stones and the disciples were participating in their own subjugation. He wondered who all this violence had really served after all. After he'd stopped dancing and playing football, his identity had narrowed to a sliver, gang member and almost nothing else. Now, 2 decades later, he felt it expanding again. There was more to life and to him. He read Explosion of Chicago's Black Street Gangs by Useni Eugene Perkins, a history going back to 1900. I started to understand that this whole thing is so much bigger than the limits I had put on it. This is not a Blackstone thing, it's a Black people thing. Recognizing systemic racism in Chicago and America did not demoralize Curtis, it seemed to energize him. He was, as he put it, getting to the root cause. I love this for him. There's a word for this in psychology. It's called recategorization, and it means swapping out a narrow identity for a broader one. And it feels really good. It feels like I can't even describe how fucking cool recategorization feels mentally and emotionally. It's dope as hell. This recategorization widened the lens on Curtis's enemy and on Curtis himself. He started to question the voice in his head. that had been telling him for years that he was fundamentally flawed. Maybe he wasn't, and maybe those disciples weren't either. There were bigger problems underneath the crock pots of gang rivalries and stolen watches. The story he'd been telling himself about his failures as a son and a father was a subplot, he realized. Not untrue, but not the whole truth either. He started replacing something small and suffocating with something bigger. The root cause is bigger than the pull of conflict, Curtis said. Everything my people have gone through to get to this point, and now we're killing each other, I owe more to my ancestors than I do to this organization. He built a new vantage point above the fray, a way to see himself, his old conflict, and his new purpose in alignment. This expansion is a running theme in every story I've encountered of people shifting out of high conflict. Something happens to slow time and create space. Maybe the birth of a child, maybe the death of a loved one, maybe even a stint in prison or the signing of a peace treaty. And in that precious space, under the right conditions, something new begins to grow. Around this time, the Reverend Michael Fledger, a local priest and longtime peace activist in Foster Park, noticed something. Curtis was acting differently. He was no longer part of the problem. He was still hanging out near Foster Park, but he seemed different, removed, like a man in some kind of transition. So Fledger started talking to Curtis every time he saw him. I was extremely impressed with him, with his intelligence, with his wisdom, Fledger said. He was able to bridge the younger guys and the older. When I find people like that, I want to learn from them. One day, Fledger told Curtis he wanted to start a peace league for gang members to play basketball. And he wanted Curtis to coach a Stones team to play against a Disciples team naturally in a peace tournament featuring four of the most active gangs at the time. It was a way to help the neighborhood kids. But Fledger was also helping Curtis. He was welcoming Curtis home, recognizing his new role in the neighborhood. It was a philosophy that Fledger preached about in his sermons and on street corners. We cannot wait for law enforcement or for government, he said at peace marches. We must reach out to our brothers in the community. Stop demonizing them. Stop telling them they're nothing but gangbangers. Let them know you're our sons, you're our daughters. We love you and respect you. Curtis was skeptical. These guys were out there killing each other. Now you want them to play basketball in a tournament? Be serious. But basketball legend and Chicago native Isaiah Thomas was on board to help, and Curtis knew Fledger wasn't one to quit. So he agreed, and he started to talk to younger guys he knew were in need of some time and space. With Fledger and also with Ceasefire, a violence interruption program in Chicago, now known as Cure Violence, Curtis walked up to groups of young men on corners that most people avoided. If he'd been willing to risk his life for the conflict, he could risk it for the peace. On the days leading up to the tournament, Curtis had trouble sleeping. My mind was everywhere. I was getting beside myself, he said. There had been near misses during the practices, guys wanting to fight, waiting outside with guns. The situation felt volatile. The games would be played at Father Fledger's church, which was in Disciples' territory. That was a risky place for the Stones to be. To reduce the uncontrolled variables, they rented buses to get the players there safely, even though it was close enough to walk. On December 22nd, 2012, the buses pulled into the church parking lot. 48 young men came out to play. Chicago Bulls stars Derrick Rose, Joakim Noah, and Ty Gibson came to help coach the teams. Two NBA referees officiated. Thousands of people turned out to watch, more than the church gym could comfortably hold. Hundreds of spectators had to be turned away. There were camera crews from CNN, ABC, and ESPN. The Nation of Islam provided security. The competition was intense. There were some hard fouls, without a doubt, but not a single act of violence. Men who had been shooting at each other the week before found themselves on the same court. Gang identities temporarily faded, and other identities lit up that day. Identities as players, as fans, as Chicagoans. Afterward, Curtis could breathe again. He marveled at how well it had gone. It's crazy how, in that moment, everybody could put everything else aside. It was proof of what people could do under the right conditions, just around the corner from Foster Park. Maybe it was possible one day to expand the identities of these young men for more than a day, to show them how much bigger the sky was than it seemed. Maybe this was something he could do, something that made his past make sense. In 2014, Curtis and his wife separated. Seeing her go was almost more than he could survive. After all the losses he'd suffered, this one felt like treason. As he followed her social media posts about her new life, it took all his strength not to revert to his old one, spreading the pain around one more time. These were lonely times. But with each passing month, Curtis's new identity got stronger, clearer around the edges. He got introduced to filmmaker Spike Lee, who gave Curtis a small role in Chirac, a movie about gang violence on the south side of Chicago. Curtis started speaking publicly about gang violence, appearing on The Steve Harvey Show and The Daily Show. The Peace League became a permanent institution, expanding to 6 and then 8 teams, meeting every Monday night for 12 weeks for food and mentoring sessions, followed by basketball. The league offered GED classes for young men looking to finish high school, as well as internships and business suits for job interviews. A Bulls player donated 250 tickets to home games so that the young men could come to games together. 2.5 years after they split up, Curtis and his wife got back together. They were both different people from who they'd been. And after their separation, they were able to meet each other as such. It was like Curtis's old life and his new life were starting to function together, intertwined like two strands of DNA. Not long afterward, Curtis finally found Billy, the man who had shot high school basketball star Benji Wilson decades before, the disciple he'd been hunting for most of his life. It was on a Friday, and Curtis was attending prayers at a Southside Muslim organization that does violence prevention work. Billy had just started working there, as it happened. Incredibly, they were doing the same work, he and his lifelong enemy. Now they were middle-aged men. Billy's goatee was flecked with white, but still, when Curtis saw him, he felt 12 years old all over again. Anger and pain coursed through his chest, like the scar of an old war wound had been ripped open. He felt his pulse quicken. But this was the new Curtis, not the old one. So he walked over to Billy and introduced himself. "Damn, I wanted to kill you," he said, shaking his head. Then he laughed, that deep belly laugh of his. But he kept staring at Billy like he was seeing a ghost, like he was afraid to blink lest he disappear. Billy did not remember Curtis from the neighborhood, but he'd had similar encounters before, many times. He'd broken hearts all over Chicago the day he'd killed Benji Wilson, and he knew nothing had been forgiven. "Did you think I was just going to let you kill me?" Billy said, smiling back at Curtis. Then he said what he usually said in these situations. "Man, I want to tell you what happened." Curtis paused. Was he really going to let the gangster disciple who murdered Benji Wilson explain himself? He inhaled a long, deep breath. "Shit, okay," he said. And so they began to talk together. A different story. That morning, back in 1984, Billy had left his house early in pursuit of some form of justice. His cousin Cindy had gotten robbed the day before. She was playing arcade games at a corner store near her high school when some kid had grabbed $10 out of her purse. When she demanded it back, he'd said, "Bitch, if you want your money, come get it." Then he'd put the money down the front of his pants and walked out. That story infuriated Billy. It was about more than the money, see? It was about respect. He didn't go to Cindy's school, but he figured he'd better try to fix this. It felt like his duty. He was 16, grieving his father, who had died of lung cancer a year before, and looking to spread some pain around and make things right. Like Curtis, Billy lived a block away from Foster Park. He'd spent half his childhood there playing baseball, his favorite sport. But he was in high school now and things had changed. He was a gangster disciple, and Foster Park was dominated by Stones. Billy's father had been a Stone once, but that was a long time ago. These days, it was too dangerous for Billy to go to Foster Park. To help his cousin get her money back, Billy decided to go to her high school the next day. Just in case, he'd better bring the .22 caliber revolver he'd found hidden under his aunt's mattress. If he was going to confront this guy, it felt safer to have a gun. It was, in his mind, like a security blanket, a backup he could count on. He tucked it in his waistband and headed out with his friend Omar. Outside of Cindy's school, Billy and Omar ran into a guy Billy knew. someone who knew everyone. The guy said he knew who had stolen the money and he would deal with it. This guy was a peacemaker of sorts, just the right person to run into at just the right time. So he gave Billy the money for his cousin from his own pocket. Problem solved. Satisfied, Billy and Omar walked away down Vincennes Avenue. They started talking to a girl they knew. Then they waited on the corner while she went into a store to buy some food. It was winter in Chicago, and the wind whipped Billy's face that morning, making tears roll down his cheeks. He shuffled back and forth on the sidewalk, trying to stay warm. He started to wonder what he was still doing there. He'd gotten the money. He should be getting back to school. That's when a tall guy, the tallest person he'd ever seen, shoved Billy out of the way as he went by. Billy almost fell down from the force of that push. At first, he thought the guy must be running from somebody. Why else would he shove him like that? But the guy kept walking away down the sidewalk. The guy was angry, talking in heated tones to a girl walking with him. It must have been his girlfriend. Maybe they were having some sort of a fight. Billy waited for a beat, expecting the tall boy to turn and say, "Hey man, I'm sorry." He was hoping the guy would turn, but he kept walking, just like nothing had happened. Every step away that guy took felt like an insult, like Billy was nothing, nobody. "Man, ain't you gonna say excuse me?" Billy yelled. The guy turned. In his trench coat, he looked huge. And he looked furious, as if Billy had disrespected him, not the other way around. N-word. "Fuck you. I don't owe you an excuse." Billy couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Fuck you." N-word. "You pushed me. You need to say excuse me." People were watching. He couldn't let this go. Benji stepped away from his girlfriend and toward Billy. He wasn't backing down, but Billy knew he did not want to fight someone so big. It was all happening so fast, and it didn't make any sense. Then Billy remembered he'd brought backup. He unzipped his jacket to show the guy his gun. That would end this. But it didn't work. Benji did not back down. He had learned to meet disrespect with force just like Billy. A man did not show weakness. A man did not walk away. Weak men got killed. Benji's girlfriend started screaming. "He's got a gun! He's got a gun, Ben!" But Benji didn't seem to care. "What are you gonna do? Shoot me now?" Billy felt his options falling away. "Man, don't walk up on me." Then Benji lunged toward Billy, or maybe away from his girlfriend who was trying to pull him back. It was hard to tell because it happened so fast. That's when Billy pulled out the gun. All of a sudden, he could hear his grandfather's advice in his head. Don't pull a gun on somebody unless you plan to use it. If he didn't use it, this guy could use it on him. Billy fired twice, hitting Benji both times. Benji staggered backwards. He was bleeding heavily. He looked most of all shocked. What had just happened? How could it come to this? Two boys are posturing on a sidewalk, and then this? In that frozen moment, everything changed. Billy had done something he could never undo, and he knew it at once. Just like that, he went from being enraged at Benji to being worried about him. He wanted more than anything for Benji to survive. He did not know this boy's gang affiliation. It never entered his mind. Yeah, it's absolutely fucking heartbreaking. It's really tragic. As Benji's girlfriend screamed, Billy ran the other way. He sprinted past the row houses and the chain link fences, thinking all the time about the boy he'd shot. "He became the most important person to me," Billy wrote later. "This unknown tall stranger I'd left struggling for his life." When he got to his cousin's house, the TV was on. The programming was interrupted for a breaking news flash. Benji Wilson, star basketball player, was shot by two gang members in an apparent attempted robbery. The face that flashed across the screen was familiar. It was the guy he'd shot. The TV was talking about him. This was the first time Billy understood he'd shot someone famous. His mind struggled to comprehend the magnitude of what he'd done. He'd shot that boy, and now the news was saying it was gang related, saying it was a robbery. It was like he'd pushed over a domino that touched off a nuclear reaction. Every moment seemed to get worse than the next. He didn't know what to do, but he felt certain he should leave his cousin's house. He walked through the neighborhood, reeling. He kept expecting the cops to jump out and grab him at any time. What he wanted most of all was to talk to his mom. The police picked Billy up at his aunt's house around midnight. They brought him to the station and interrogated him alone, asking if he was looking to rob someone that day. He said no. He told them what happened over and over, but it didn't seem to matter what he said. The story was out of his hands. The dominoes had fallen. Finally, he asked for a lawyer. The police left the room and a lawyer came in. But it wasn't a defense attorney, Billy said. It was the prosecutor. The prosecutor had a statement he wanted Billy to sign, one that said Billy had tried to rob Benji. The story was written before Billy got to tell it. Billy says he kept telling the prosecutor that it wasn't true, but the man said it was the only way he could see his mom. Billy signed the statement. Now the prosecutor could charge him with attempted robbery, which would come with a longer prison sentence than manslaughter alone. The government wanted revenge, just like Jesse Jackson, just like Curtis, just like the whole city. And if the story didn't fit, the lawyers would make it fit. After that, Billy was moved to a holding cell where he could see a TV playing. That morning, there was breaking news once again. Billy watched through the bars, bracing himself. It was over. Benji had died. The worst had happened. Billy sat in the cell, absorbing the truth. He had ended the life of a human being. Pain twisted through his chest like tiny shards of glass. He felt a kind of despair he'd never felt before, even after his own father had died. What God had created, Billy kept thinking, he had destroyed. Billy and Omar were led, handcuffed, past TV news cameras and brought before a judge for a bail hearing. After the judge denied bail, an older female sheriff's deputy leaned in toward Billy. "You killed that boy," she said. "I hope they give y'all the death penalty and they let me pull the switch on you motherfuckers." The Cook County State's Attorney's Office tried both Billy and Omar as adults. It took jurors just over an hour to find them guilty of murder and attempted robbery. There was never any question at all, one juror had said afterward. It was very unanimous. There was no mention of gangs at trial. The judge had ordered the lawyers not to refer to gangs because there was no evidence of their relevance, but the news media still brought them up in the coverage of the trial. Billy served 19 years and 9 months in prison for killing Benji Wilson. Omar, who had not fired the gun, served 16 years. Billy's side of the story did not get told in the aftermath of the shooting. There was no robbery, no gangbanging, no sense to it at all. The us versus them machine was hard to turn off. There were star athletes and there were gang members, Stones and Disciples, Hatfields and McCoys. Today, most of the violence on the streets of Chicago looks just like this. Young men with fragile egos and powerful weapons. They may be gang members, even rival gang members, but that's rarely the whole story. That's just the part of the story that keeps the momentum going. Come to think of it, Benji was wearing a skull cap that day, as Billy remembered it, not a hat turned to the left, or the right, or any which way. What if we became friends 30 years ago? Curtis listened to Billy's story all the way to the end. The story felt, to him, deeply inadequate and entirely believable. He knew in his gut that Billy was telling the truth. He'd seen the same sad plot play out so many times in Chicago. One young man having a real bad day runs into another one with a gun. It was sickening how familiar it was. As Billy finished, Curtis had one thought, one he never could have imagined having before. That could have been me. He could picture being a teenager and getting shoved just like that, and he could imagine refusing to back down, too, if he hadn't recognized Benji Wilson. I probably would have shot him, too. It made Curtis dizzy thinking about it. This encounter with Billy unraveled his narrative about the disciples and Benji Wilson. The story that had ordered his life for so long was not true, and it never had been. There was no hat to the left, no gang storyline at all. The more he thought about it, the more he began to question every other assumption he'd had about this feud. It even occurred to him suddenly to doubt the very fundamentals, basic premises he'd always assumed were true, without question. And this is exactly how like cult deprogramming happens. Like this is the turning point for leaving a cult, being ready to like come out of it and rejoin the real world. You reach a breaking point and it's a bunch of things pile up and then there's something that, if you know that Reddit story about the guy who got obsessed with staring at a lamp and then woke up from a coma and had like hallucinated the past 30 years of his life, it's a little bit like that. Like you just can't stop staring at the fucking lamp, and then all of a sudden you wake up and you've been in a cult for 12 years. Now he wondered, was Benji Wilson ever actually a stone? When he'd seen him playing basketball, his hat was to the left, that much Curtis knew. But now he felt a tremor underneath everything. Maybe Benji's hat had just got knocked that way when he was playing. Maybe it wasn't intentional. It was disorienting, like everything was up for grabs. Everything. This is another peculiarity of high conflict. It can be one sided. It can spiral out of a feud that lives mostly in our own heads. The other person may never even know they're in our high conflict at all, which means that we all may appear in conflicts we aren't even aware of. How many feuds was Curtis featured in that he'd never known about? How many people dreamed of killing him? Probably quite a few. By then, Curtis had already shifted out of high conflict, but Billy's story gave him another way to stay out. He and Billy were no longer enemies. They were in the same category, and they always had been. He could see that now. It was almost absurd now that he thought about it. They'd come up in the same neighborhood, playing at the same park. Both of them were friends with Jesse, the backflipping boy who had gotten killed selling hot dogs so many years before. Both of them had grieved Jesse's murder without knowing it. We had so much more in common than we had differences. Curtis just wished he could have seen it all so much earlier. His brain started running through the what ifs, as he puts it. This happened a lot. What if we had become friends 30 years ago? Curtis asked himself. It was as if he was looking through a kaleidoscope, and all the shapes kept shifting. It's hard to resist high conflict, but there are ways to boost our ability to hold on to complexity, even in us versus them conflict. The most well studied strategy is through something known as contact theory, which is a way to help people recategorize one another by spending time together under certain conditions. These encounters can interrupt the cascading assumptions we make about each other, essentially slowing down conflict and making space. Once people have met and kind of liked each other, they have a harder time characterizing one another. A hat to the right may or may not mean someone is an enemy. The effectiveness of contact theory has been illustrated in more than 500 experiments all over the world. It has worked on children in Chile, Belgian high school students sent to Morocco, and prison inmates in the UK. Relationships change us way more readily than facts. British people who had had meaningful interactions with Muslims before the 7/7 London transit terrorist attacks in 2005 exhibited less prejudice toward Muslims afterward, which does make sense. Hmm. Goodbye. It sounds obvious, but why does it actually work? On one level, relationships seem to complicate the stories we tell ourselves. When we get to know people, we can't reduce them to just one thing. This is why Father Fledger and Curtis brought game members together to play basketball, to build relationships that resist caricature. And this is why Billy's story in all its complexity was important for Curtis to hear. If we try to caricature people we have come to know, it feels not only inaccurate, but vaguely disloyal. We are social creatures, allied with all kinds of groups, and disloyalty is intensely uncomfortable. Knowing people as three-dimensional humans keeps us out of the tar pits. We might still believe a negative story about our opponent, and we will continue to disagree about many things. But usually, relationships make it harder to dismiss and dehumanize other people. Oh, you're totally fine. Don't worry about it. Remember the British environmentalist and writer Mark Linus, the one who spent years protesting genetically modified food? In the first pages of this book, we saw how he eventually exited high conflict, even apologizing to the farmers he'd harassed years before. But how did he make the shift? Why then or ever? After that night hiding in the field, Mark returned to his day job as an editor and writer. Over time, he began to interview scientists. In addition to his work fighting genetically modified food, he wrote books about climate change. Scientists were important sources for him. Eventually, he got to like some of these scientists. The scientists he interviewed were trying to save the planet, just like he was. They had a lot in common. They traded personal stories, becoming colleagues, not just acquaintances. He came to admire their dedication to empirical evidence over ideology and their willingness to admit when they were wrong. Soon, he adopted their standards to his own writing. He worked to understand and incorporate rigorous scientific research, taking great care to footnote all of his arguments. In 2008, one of Mark's books received the Royal Society Prize, Britain's most prestigious award for science writing. The prize was like his formal acceptance into the tribe of serious science writers. He hadn't been shamed or called out. He'd been welcomed, and it mattered. At the ceremony, Mark did not sound like a crop killing activist anymore. To be recognized by an institution like the Royal Society, which is one of the most important scientific institutions in the whole world, is a delight and a tremendous honor for me. 3 days later, he wrote that piece for The Guardian attacking genetically modified crops, the kind of piece he'd written many times before. But this was the first time that the criticism in the comment section bothered him. The accusations and the doubt could enter his bloodstream because he'd had so many close encounters with serious scientists by then. On the surface, Mark's campaign against genetically modified food had seemed like it was about nutrition and safety, and it was. But underneath all the crockpots, it was also about belonging, like mini conflicts. For years, Mark had found a sense of purpose and identity as an activist, fighting the good fight against giant companies. It was energizing to be so right so much of the time. But over time, he cultivated another identity as a science writer. He found another way to belong, another group to call his own, just like Curtis. But his new identity clashed with the old one. For the next couple of years, Mark struggled to reconcile it all. He vacillated between his old conflict identity and his new one, not unlike Glenn Beck. Eventually, Mark felt he had to say something loudly and clearly about his evolution, if only to ease his own conscience. It wasn't really defensible to just skulk around without being honest about it. I appreciate the balls this man has. And so, 14 years after hiding from those police dogs, Mark stood up in front of that conference of farmers and scientists in Oxford, England, and publicly admitted he'd gotten seduced by high conflict. He'd actively worked against the things he'd held dear. As an environmentalist and someone who believes that everyone in this world has a right to a healthy and nutritious diet of their choosing, I could not have chosen a more counterproductive path, he said. I now regret it completely. Okay, let me check and see how much longer this chapter is because my voice do be getting tired. Oh, it is a lot longer. Okay, I'm gonna call it for tonight. I know it was only an hour, but I am eepy. And my voice is eepy. But I feel like that was very dense. I feel like we got through a lot of stuff. We ended on do. Come on, where'd you go? Page 181, just before the section that starts power for anybody reading along at home. And I will absolutely for certain be back next week. I say, not being able to predict the future. Yeah, no, that was when I first read this, that part was like I think hit me the hardest out of everything. That not to say that the rest of it isn't great. Like there is a lot of other good stuff and some stuff that made me cry and might make me cry again when we get to it. But like really actionable stuff. That's what gets me excited is when I go like, oh, that gives me like ideas of cool shit we could do to build community and like make it possible to exit high conflict without fucking dying. Anyway, thank you for watching and thank you to people in the future watching. And I will see you in the next one. Peace out.